Every spring I see gardeners hesitate, not over big things, over a single branch, a pruning shears in their hand, and a moment where they wonder, should I really cut this? Courage in the garden rarely looks dramatic. Most of the time it looks like a gardener standing quietly in front of a plant, thinking. I've started to notice that those small moments of hesitation might be one of the most important things the garden gives us. Because if you pay attention long enough, the garden begins to reveal something. Not about the plants, about us, and the strange way growth actually happens. About why so many people are drawn to gardening in the first place, and why the lessons we learn in the garden, they don't stay in the garden. They follow us into the rest of our lives. Let me introduce myself. I'm Michelle, and this space is a lot like gardening. Some things take hold right away, others take time, and a few surprise us entirely. If you're craving a thoughtful, more reflective way to think about gardening, you're always welcome here at Hosta Heaven. Today we're talking about one of the strangest things I've noticed about gardeners, and it happens every spring. The garden wakes up, the soil softens, and tools start coming out again. Suddenly, very capable people begin to hesitate. They stand in the garden with pruning shears in their hand, looking at a perfectly healthy plant and wondering if they dare cut it. If you garden, you probably recognize that moment. You're looking at something that grew beautifully last year, a shrub, a bed that might need rearranging, a perennial that should be divided, and you pause. Not because you don't care. Actually, it's the opposite. You pause because you care a lot. You don't want to ruin something that's alive. You don't want to make the wrong decision. So you stand quietly, just thinking. It's always struck me that the garden is one of the safest places to try, and somehow we still choose to play it safe. Gardeners do this all the time. I see it every season. I do it too, every season. One place this shows up most often is with hydrangeas. In my area, Easter, right now, is when we prune our panicle hydrangeas. People always ask about pruning them. Not because they're complicated. Their pruning needs vary depending on type. But that's not what I'm talking about here. Pruning asks something of you. It asks you to change something, a beautiful plant that's alive, and you're standing there with your shears looking at branches that spent all last summer growing, and you're about to decide what stays and what goes, what lives and what doesn't. There's always a small pause before the first cut. I still notice it even after years of doing this work. Running a nursery means I prune hundreds of hydrangea every year. Eventually, you stop wondering if you should cut. But that little moment before the shears close, it's still there. Just not quite so concerning now. You make the cut, and something very simple happens. You see it in a couple weeks. New growth, fresh shape, sunlight reaching where it couldn't before. The plant doesn't scold you. It doesn't hold a grudge. It just grows, usually better than it did before. And after enough seasons, you start to notice something about the garden. It doesn't require perfection. In fact, perfection doesn't seem to interest the garden at all. Plants lean, branches cross, beds evolve in ways we didn't quite plan. And yet the garden keeps growing. Life continues. Pruning isn't the only place courage shows up. Designing a garden asks for it too. Moving a hosta that's been in the same place for years. Dividing a perennial that's getting too big. My grandmother would say, getting too big for its britches. Starting a new bed is where there used to be lawn. Trying a new plant you've never grown before. Gardeners have these quiet internal conversations. Maybe I shouldn't. Is this the right place? The right time? The right decision? What if it doesn't work? And then something small inside you says, I'll give it a try. The funny thing is that the garden rarely punishes you for trying. Plants move, beds evolve. The garden grows differently than expected, but it keeps going. It keeps growing. Hostas unfurl, seasons move forward, and slowly over time you realize the garden is far more forgiving than we'd first imagined. I see this lesson unfold again and again in the nursery. Someone stands in front of a table of plants trying to choose the perfect plant. The perfect color, the perfect shape, the perfect size, the perfect spot, the perfect combination. And eventually they laugh a little and they say something like, "I'll just give it a try." And I always think, yes, that's exactly how gardening works. You try it and you see what happens. They go home, they dig a hole, they plant their plant. And a few months later, I usually see them come back, smiling. Not because everything turned out perfectly, although often it does, but because something grew. Of course, sometimes it doesn't grow. That happens too. Gardens are generous teachers, and they're honest. I remember a customer who bought a few Delosperma. He told me his granddaughter loved the bright little flowers, and he thought they would be fun to plant together. I bet they were. Delosperma are wonderful little plants, but they have one particular quirk. They're evergreen succulents, which means they really need to go into winter fairly dry. If they're holding too much moisture when freezing weather arrives, the water expands inside the plant and damages the cells. Well, these particular Delosperma were planted right near a fish pond. A beautiful spot, I'm sure, but a little too wet for Delosperma when they went into winter, at least in our area. By spring, they were gone. And you know what? That happens in gardens. Sometimes the plant isn't quite right. Sometimes the spot isn't quite right. Sometimes the weather has other plans. I have an auntie who says, "Well, that plant wasn't up to the conditions that I needed to live in." Works for me. But even when something we try doesn't work out, this garden still gives us something. We learn more about our soil, our light, our weather, our own garden conditions. We learn a little more about the living place we're tending. The next season comes and maybe we try that plant again. Maybe we choose something different. We try because that's what gardeners do. And our gardens have a way of turning mistakes into lessons. Yes, the garden has been teaching us something. Trying is not a mistake. Not trying is the real mistake. You notice it, right? The garden has been teaching us courage in a very gentle way. The risks feel real, and they are, but the consequences are surprisingly forgiving. As gardeners, we do something simple. We try something new. Usually it works. Sometimes it doesn't. We move a plant, we cut something back, we try a new spot, and the next season, we do it all over again. After enough seasons, something becomes clear. The garden doesn't seem very interested in perfection. This isn't about being perfect. Life isn't perfect. Neither is the garden. And yet everything keeps growing anyway. There's a space in every garden and in every life that feels uncertain. That space between knowing and doing. Between hesitation and action. That's where courage grows. That's where we learn who we are and how much the world can forgive us for trying our best, even when we're not successful. The garden is remarkably forgiving, and often we're very successful. You move something, you cut something, you try something new, and the garden responds the same way it always does. It keeps growing, and so do we. And maybe that's one of the secret reasons people love gardening so much, because the garden lets us practice something we long for in the rest of our life. After a while, you notice something else too. That small courage you practice in the garden, it doesn't stay in the garden, does it? It follows us into the real world. Go ahead, let it follow you. Maybe that's why gardening shapes people the way it does. The courage we practice in the garden might be very small. A cut here, a plant moved there, trying something new, trying something we're not completely sure about. But season after season, those small acts, they add up. Growth doesn't happen because everything is certain. It happens because something living keeps trying, and that includes us. If there's anywhere in the world that invites us to practice that kind of courage in a very safe space, it might just be your garden. If you've ever stood in your garden for a moment wondering if you should try something, then you probably know that feeling really well. That small, quiet courage that gardeners recognize and encourage in one another. If the garden is where you contemplate what life reveals, you're always welcome here at Hosta Heaven. Until the next chapter in the Hosta Garden.